All right, welcome to the deep dive, everybody. Ready to jump into something pretty interesting today.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Cool. Today, we're going deep on cabotage.
Cabotage.
You gave us a whole bunch of sources on this, some global stuff,
Yeah.
some very U.S.-centric, like one very specific law, the Merchant Marine Act of 1920,
Right.
or as most people know it, the Jones Act.
Mm.
So we're going to unpack what cabotage even means, because it comes up in all kinds of transportation, ships, planes, even trains and trucks.
Uh-huh.
But then we're going to zero in on the Jones Act here in the U.S.
Yeah.
and try to figure out why it's such a big deal and why people have such strong opinions about it.
Yeah, it definitely gets people talking. And I think what's interesting about cabotage is that it might seem like a pretty niche topic,
Right.
kind of obscure, but it actually reveals a lot about how countries approach their economies
Yeah?
and their national interests. Like, it goes way beyond just moving stuff around.
For sure.
It's connected to national security, economic development, even how countries deal with each other on the global stage.
Okay, so let's break down the word itself. Cabotage. It has a pretty interesting history.
It does.
It comes from the French word caboter, meaning to travel along the coast. So right away, you see the connection to shipping.
Yeah, absolutely.
It might be related to Cape, geographically speaking, or maybe even a certain type of boat. But one thing's for sure.
What's that?
It has nothing to do with the explorer, Cabot.
Nope, that's a common misconception.
Fun fact. But anyway, it started with shipping, that much is clear. But over time, cabotage has expanded to cover a lot more.
It has.
These days, we're not just talking about ships. It includes aviation, rail, even road transport. Basically, any transportation service that happens entirely within one country's borders.
Exactly. Domestic transport, basically.
And then there's this whole concept of cabotage rights, which, if I understand correctly, are basically permissions given to a company from one country to do business in another.
That's the gist, yeah.
And in the world of aviation, these rights, especially the right to fly domestic routes in another country, they tend to be pretty tightly controlled.
They do, and it makes sense when you think about it. Most countries want to protect their own airlines. Competition from foreign carriers can be tough to deal with.
Yeah, makes sense.
But it's not just about economics either. There are serious national security and safety concerns. When you let foreign airlines operate freely within your borders, you have to ask, who's really in control? Who's making sure everything's up to standard?
That's a good point. Although the EU seems to be a big exception to this, right?
They are, yeah. EU member states generally give each other these cabotage rights. So you see a lot of airlines operating domestic flights in countries that aren't their home base.
Interesting. All right, so let's move from the skies down to the sea, where this whole cabotage idea began, shipping. It seems like most countries with a coastline have some kind of cabotage laws on the books.
Oh, yeah, most definitely. And the reasons are often the same as in aviation. Protect domestic industries, make sure they've got enough ships if there's a national emergency, like a crisis where you need your own fleet.
Right.
And also to keep safety standards high within their own waters.
And our sources gave us some really interesting examples of how different countries handle this, like Indonesia.
Right.
They really shifted toward a more protectionist cabotage policy back in 2005.
They did, after a period where foreign vessels had a pretty easy time operating there.
So that was a conscious decision to bolster their own shipping industry.
It was. And I think it shows how national policies on this can shift, depending on a country's strategic goals and economic priorities at the time.
Yeah, totally. Then there's the Philippines. Their cabotage law goes all the way back to 1937.
1937, wow.
Yeah, pretty old. Traditionally, it limited domestic trade to ships registered in the Philippines.
Which makes sense, right. Protecting your own.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then they passed a new law in 2015, which allows foreign vessels carrying exports to stop at multiple ports within the Philippines. So it's like they're trying to find that balance.
Right, exactly. Between protecting their local shipping industry and making it easier for international trade to flow.
And then there's China. They seem to have a pretty strict system.
They do. Any foreign ship wanting to do domestic transport or transshipment in China needs to get permission from their Ministry of Transport first.
And it's interesting that Hong Kong and Macau have their own separate rules, with no foreign ships allowed to transport between them and mainland China.
Right. And even crossing the Taiwan Strait requires special permits. It shows how sensitive these waterways can be.
Absolutely. So Indonesia moving toward protectionism, the Philippines trying to strike a balance, and China holding firm, all different approaches.
Yeah. But what ties them together is that they all want to maintain control over their own strategically important waterways.
Makes sense. And it's worth noting that the EU actually used to have restrictions on cabotage for newer members like Greece, Spain, and Portugal.
They did.
But they eventually got rid of them. Seems
Yeah.
like they learned over time and moved towards more integration within the bloc.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's not always a static thing. Policies can change and evolve.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And internationally, there are rules like the Hague-Visby rules, but those don't automatically apply to cabotage.
right. Each country gets to decide how they want to handle it.
Exactly. It's up to their own national laws. Like in the UK, their Carriage of Goods by Sea Act of 1971 specifically addresses this.
It's a lot of variation out there.
Okay, now let's talk about the big one here in the U.S. The Merchant Marine Act of 1920, better known as the Jones Act. This law lays down some pretty specific rules for anything shipped by water between U.S. ports.
It does.
Can you break down exactly what the Jones Act requires?
Sure. So basically, any ship carrying goods between U.S. ports has to meet 4 key requirements. It has to be U.S. built, U.S. flagged, U.S. owned, and crewed by U.S. citizens or permanent residents.
Wow, so pretty much all American.
Yeah, pretty much. And that U.S. built part is really specific. It means the major components of the hull, the superstructure, all of that has to be fabricated and assembled right here in the U.S.
So it's not just about slapping it together here. The actual pieces have to be made in America, too.
Exactly. Even the steel plates, the big structural pieces, all made in the USA.
Okay, that makes sense. And this doesn't just apply to, like, the mainland U.S., right?
Yep. It covers transport between all points in the U.S. territorial sea, which is that 3-mile zone off the coast, as well as internal waters and U.S. territories and possessions.
So we're talking places like Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Alaska, Guam, all that.
All of those, yep. It even applies to structures on the outer continental shelf used for oil and gas stuff.
Interesting. And there's that other law, too, right? The Passenger Vessel Services Act from 1886.
Right. Separate law, but similar idea. Basically, no foreign ships carrying passengers between U.S. ports.
Got it. So Jones Act for goods, Passenger Vessel Services Act for people. But same basic principle.
Yeah, same idea. Keep it domestic.
Okay, now let's shift back to aviation cabotage for a minute.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that it's generally less common than in shipping. Why is that?
Well, there are a few reasons. For one, the Chicago Convention, which is like the big international agreement on aviation, it actually limits how much countries can grant these exclusive cabotage rights. So that makes it less useful as a bargaining chip in bilateral air agreements. And most open skies agreements, those deals that aim to make international air travel easier, they don't usually include anything about cabotage either.
Interesting. But the EU, again, is an exception here.
Totally. EU-licensed carriers can pretty much operate domestic routes in any EU country, with some limits, of course. So you see airlines like Ryanair, EasyJet, Vueling, Wizz Air, even Aer Lingus, all flying domestic routes in countries other than where they're based.
So they basically created a single aviation market within the EU.
Exactly. It's like they treat each other's airlines as domestic for those internal routes.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And Australia and New Zealand have that interesting agreement, too, through their Closer Economic Relations Agreement.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. They allow reciprocal domestic and international flights between the two countries.
So you see Jetstar, an Australian airline, flying domestic routes in New Zealand, and Air New Zealand flying a domestic route in Australia.
Right. And they also fly a couple of international routes that are kind of unique to that agreement, like Sydney to Norfolk Island, which is Australian territory, and Sydney to Rarotonga, which is part of the Cook Islands, associated with New Zealand.
So a carefully balanced system there.
Yeah. They've worked out a way to allow some cross-border flights while still maintaining some distinctions, especially when it comes to which airlines can be flag carriers on those international routes.
Right. And it's kind of interesting that Australia has a rule where a foreign-owned airline can operate domestically as long as it's incorporated in Australia.
They do.
But that same airline can't be a flag carrier for Australia on international routes, although their subsidiaries can. It's all very nuanced.
It is. It shows you just how much thought goes into these policies and how different countries have different priorities when it comes to balancing competition and control.
For sure. And then there's Chile. Their approach is totally different, almost radical, you could say.
It is pretty liberal. Since 1979, they've been allowing foreign airlines to fly domestic routes in Chile, as long as the foreign airline's home country gives the same treatment to Chilean Airlines.
Oh, a tit-for-tat kind of thing.
Yeah, reciprocity. But even without that, a foreign company can set up a Chilean subsidiary and fly domestic routes.
That's really open. What's the thinking behind that?
Well, Chile's geography probably has something to do with it. It's a long, narrow country, so they need good air connections. And this open policy was also meant to encourage other countries to open up their aviation markets, too.
Ah, so it benefits their own flag carrier, LATAM Chile,
Wow.
when they expand internationally?
Exactly. It's a smart strategy. They're thinking about both domestic needs and global competitiveness.
Makes sense. Our sources also mentioned a few other interesting situations with aviation cabotage. Like West Berlin before 1991, Lufthansa, the German airline, couldn't fly there.
Right. That was a Cold War thing. West Berlin was technically separate from both East and West Germany, so those routes were flown by Pan Am, British Airways, and Air France.
Wow, history really shapes these things. And there was also that time when Polynesian Airlines got temporary permission to fly within American Samoa.
Yeah, that was after U.S. carriers stopped flying there, so they had to find a solution to keep those islands connected.
Interesting. So exceptions can be made in emergencies or when vital services are at stake.
Exactly. And more recently, Russia has been talking about offering cabotage agreements to what they call friendly countries like India and China.
Because of the sanctions they're facing.
Yeah, they need to find ways to keep their airlines operating. So it's another example of how international relations and economic pressures can change the game.
It's fascinating how many factors are at play. And it's not just air and sea, right? Even in road transport, the EU has some limited cabotage rules.
They do. If a truck from one EU country delivers goods to another EU country, it can then pick up and deliver other goods within that second country before heading back home.
So it's about making the most of the trip, I guess.
Yeah, it's part of their whole integrated market approach. More efficient use of transport resources.
Makes sense. Now, there are a couple of other concepts that are related to this. One is called modified sixth freedom.
Ah, yes, that one gets a little tricky.
It involves carrying passengers between 2 points in one country, but the flight goes through a hub in another country.
Right, so like a passenger flying from Boston to Seattle, but the flight stops in Toronto.
And that's generally considered cabotage, right? Not left.
Most countries see it that way, yeah. The U.S. actually fined Asiana Airlines for doing this a while back with flights that stopped in Guam and Saipan.
So they're pretty strict about it.
Mm.
And then there are tag rights.
Right. That's when an airline flies a route that stops in a foreign country, but only to pick up or drop off passengers who are connecting to or from an international flight.
Like that Qantas flight from New York to Los Angeles, which stops in Sydney just for those connecting passengers.
Exactly. That's not usually considered cabotage because the primary purpose of the flight is international, not domestic.
Got it. It's all about the intent and who they're serving. Okay, so we've seen how different countries approach cabotage in shipping and aviation. Now let's dive back into the Jones Act here in the U.S.
Yeah.
We've talked about those core requirements. U.S. built, flagged, owned, and crewed.
Right.
But what's the story behind this law? What led to it being passed back in 1920?
Well, believe it or not, laws restricting domestic trade to American ships go way back in U.S. history.
Really?
Oh, yeah. All the way back to the early days of the country. They were kind of modeled after the British Navigation Acts.
Huh, interesting.
So the Jones Act was basically a revival of that idea. After those rules were temporarily suspended during World War I, Senator Wesley Jones, the guy behind the act, he argued that the U.S. needed a strong merchant marine for national defense and for trade.
So it was all about being self-sufficient, having their own ships.
Exactly, not relying on other countries, especially in times of war.
And this wasn't just a one-time thing either, right? The Merchant Marine Act of 1936 expanded on this.
Yeah, definitely. That act really solidified things. It established the U.S. Maritime Commission, which is still around today, and it laid out even more specific requirements for the American merchant marine.
Like what kind of requirements?
Well, they said the U.S. merchant marine should be able to carry all domestic waterborne commerce, and a good chunk of foreign commerce, too. It also had to be able to serve as a naval auxiliary in times of war. Plus, the emphasis on U.S. ownership, construction, and crewing was really hammered home. They wanted a high percentage of U.S. citizens working on those ships.
So a really comprehensive set of rules aimed at building up that American maritime industry.
Yeah, for sure. They weren't messing around.
Okay, so what have been the actual effects of the Jones Act since it was passed? I imagine it's had a lot of consequences, both good and bad.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely a complex issue. One of the most obvious effects is that it prevents foreign ships from transporting goods between the contiguous U.S. and those non-contiguous parts we talked about earlier.
Like Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Alaska, all that.
Exactly. So that has a big impact on trade routes and the cost of shipping to those places.
And speaking of Puerto Rico, the sources we looked at had some different opinions on how the Jones Act has affected them economically.
They did.
There was a study from the New York Fed back in 2012 that suggested it might actually be hurting Puerto Rico's development.
Right.
But then a GAO report from 2013 said it was really hard to say for sure what the Jones Act's specific impact on freight rates is, because there are so many other things going on in the market.
Yeah, that's the tricky part. It's hard to isolate the effects of the Jones Act from all the other factors influencing shipping costs.
And it's interesting that Puerto Rico's governor actually asked for a permanent exemption from air cabotage laws just recently.
Yeah, in February of 2025. So it's clear that there are still a lot of strong feelings about these restrictions and their impact on places like Puerto Rico.
Absolutely. Now, another big area where the Jones Act has had an impact is U.S. shipbuilding.
Right.
Supporters argue that it's essential for keeping that industry alive, which they see is vital for both commercial ships and government vessels, including those naval auxiliaries we talked about earlier.
Yeah, and they point to the fact that without the Jones Act, the government might not even be able to buy those auxiliary ships from U.S. companies anymore.
Because the industry would decline without that guaranteed demand.
Exactly. And there was a study by CSBA, the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, back in 2020 that really highlighted that risk.
But critics of the Jones Act say it's just protectionism,
They do.
that it drives up costs and stifles innovation in shipbuilding. They argue that American shipyards would actually become more competitive if they had to compete with foreign companies.
Right. It's that classic debate between protecting domestic industries and embracing free trade. And there's evidence to support both sides. A Congressional Research Service report from 2019 pointed out that the U.S. shipbuilding industry has been losing ground globally.
And the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, they did some analysis and estimated that getting rid of the Jones Act could actually boost U.S. shipbuilding output significantly.
So it's a really tough question. Is the Jones Act actually achieving its goal of a strong American shipbuilding industry, or is it holding the industry back?
No easy answers there. Another big argument in favor of the Jones Act is national security.
Right, that's a key one. The idea is that we need to be able to build our own ships and have our own merchant marine in case of war, so we're not reliant on other countries.
Which goes back to those original concerns from World War I.
Exactly, and supporters argue that it's not just about having enough ships, it's also about having a skilled workforce who can build and operate those ships.
A ready reserve of mariners.
Yes, exactly. And that ties into homeland security, too. By requiring ships involved in things like dredging and salvage operations to be U.S.-owned and crewed, it reduces the risk of foreign entities getting access to sensitive areas of our waterways.
Right, so it's not just about ships and cargo, it's about who's on those ships and what they have access to.
Exactly. And there was a GAO study in 2011 that looked at how many foreign seafarers were entering U.S. ports. While they didn't find any direct link to terrorism, the Department of Homeland Security was still concerned about the potential for illegal entry through our ports.
So the Jones Act's U.S. crewing requirement is seen as one way to address that.
Yeah, it's about minimizing those risks.
Now, we also saw some examples where the Jones Act might have actually caused some problems, like that situation with liquefied natural gas, LNG.
Oh, right. Back in 2018, the Northeast U.S. ended up having to import LNG from Russia because there weren't enough Jones Act-compliant tankers available to transport it from other parts of the U.S.
So ironically, this law meant to protect U.S. interests ended up making the U.S. reliant on Russia for energy.
It's definitely a situation where the restrictions of the Jones Act had unintended consequences, and it sparked a lot of debate about whether those restrictions were really worth it in that case.
For sure. And more recently, the Jones Act has been a factor in the development of offshore wind farms.
Yes, that's right.
Apparently, there aren't enough Jones Act-compliant vessels that can do the work of installing and maintaining those wind turbines.
Which has led to delays and even cancellations of some projects.
So it's another example of how the Jones Act can create challenges for new industries.
It's a reminder that these laws don't exist in a vacuum. They interact with the real world in complex ways, and sometimes those interactions lead to unexpected outcomes.
Okay, so we've got strong arguments on both sides of this debate. Supporters of the Jones Act say it's vital for the economy, for national security, for protecting jobs in shipbuilding, and the merchant marine. They also argue that it helps to maintain high standards for safety and environmental protection on U.S. ships.
Right, and they see it as a way to make sure those jobs stay in the U.S., supporting American workers and families.
But critics say it's just too expensive, that it drives up the cost of shipping, especially to those non-contiguous areas like Hawaii and Puerto Rico. And they point to studies that suggest the U.S. economy would actually benefit if the Jones Act were repealed.
They also argue that it hasn't actually been that successful in keeping the American merchant marine strong, because despite the law's protections, the number of ships in the Jones Act fleet has actually declined quite a bit over the years.
And they say the U.S. is missing out on the benefits of short-sea shipping, which is more common in other parts of the world.
Right, that's where goods are transported between ports along the coast rather than by land, which can be more efficient and environmentally friendly in some cases.
So it's a complicated issue with valid points on both sides. But despite all the debate, efforts to repeal or even significantly change the Jones Act have been unsuccessful so far.
Yeah, there have been a lot of attempts. Since 2010, there have been bills introduced in Congress, like the Open America's Waters Act, and other bills that specifically focus on easing the restrictions for shipping to places like Puerto Rico. But none of them have managed to get rid of the Jones Act altogether.
But it seems like there's growing support for at least reforming some aspects of it.
That's true. I think there's a recognition that the law might need some updating to reflect the realities of the 21st century.
Right. And then there's the whole issue of waivers. In certain situations, the Department of Homeland Security can grant a waiver that allows a foreign ship to operate under the Jones Act.
Yeah, that's usually in emergencies like after a natural disaster. We saw that happen after Hurricanes Katrina and Sandy. And even for that fuel shipment to Nome, Alaska back in 2010.
But there was a lot of controversy when they initially refused to grant a waiver for Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria.
Right, that caused a lot of anger and frustration. And it highlighted how those waiver decisions can be really politically charged.
For sure. It seems like those waivers show the tension between the strict rules of the Jones Act and the need to be flexible in certain situations.
Definitely. And the fact that it's the Department of Homeland Security that makes those decisions shows how much national security considerations weigh into the whole issue.
Absolutely. So to wrap up our deep dive into cabotage, it's clear that this idea of regulating transport within a country's borders is a lot more complex than it might seem at first glance.
It is.
Countries have to balance a whole bunch of factors, from protecting their own industries and jobs to ensuring national security to keeping costs down for consumers and businesses. And the Jones Act here in the U.S. is a perfect example of how tricky those trade-offs can be.
It really is a microcosm of that global struggle, isn't it? Finding that sweet spot between looking after your own interests and engaging with the global economy.
Absolutely. And on that note, considering everything we've learned about cabotage and the Jones Act, I think it's worth asking ourselves, what should be the top priorities when a country decides how to regulate its domestic transport industries?
That's a great question.
Is it all about economic self-sufficiency, national security? Or is it more important to ensure fair prices and efficient transport for everyone? It's something for all of us to consider.
Definitely something to think about.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure.
Until next time.